The blood on his shirt was already turning black by the time he reached the door of the diner. He did not remember walking the 6 blocks from the alley where the bullet had grazed his ribs. He did not remember the 3 men he had left behind him, bleeding worse than he was. All he remembered was the small yellow glow coming from a window on a dead street at 3 in the morning, and the word painted across the glass in chipped gold letters, "Open." He pushed the door. A bell rang, bright and stupid and completely wrong for the moment. A woman looked up from behind the counter. She was not what he expected to find alive at this hour. She was soft everywhere a woman like the ones in his world were sharp. Round face, full arms, a body she did not apologize for. Dark curly hair pulled back in a bun that had mostly given up. She had flour on her apron and tired kindness in her eyes, the kind of tired that came from working, not from staying up late doing nothing. She looked at his shirt. She looked at his face. She did not scream. "Sir, you're bleeding," she said, already moving around the counter, already reaching for the first aid kit under the register like this was a Tuesday. "Sit down before you fall down." He almost laughed. Nobody called him sir anymore. Men flinched when they said his name. Women purred it. But this woman, this stranger with flour on her hands, said sir the way you'd say it to anyone who walked through a door bleeding, because to her, in that moment, he was not Dante Osorio. He was just a hurt man who needed help. He sat down anyway. He should not have.
Before we go any further, please like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know what city you're watching from in the comments. All right, let's continue.
3 weeks before that night, Dante Osorio stood in the middle of his own club like a king who was bored of his kingdom. El Rey took up the entire top floor of a building he owned outright, glass walls overlooking Miami's skyline, music that cost more to produce than most people's houses. Women moved through the crowd in dresses that had been chosen specifically to be noticed by him. There were, by his brother's crude count, over 100 of them who would have left with him that night if he had so much as glanced their way twice. He glanced at none of them. "You're doing it again," his brother said, sliding into the seat beside him with a drink he hadn't asked for. "It's not a party, it's a transaction disguised as a party. Everything is a transaction to you. That's how we're still alive." Mateo laughed, but there was truth under it, and both of them knew it. Their father had built an empire on cocaine roots and cold decisions. Their father was also dead, shot in his own driveway 4 years ago by a rival family that still hadn't been fully answered for it. Dante had taken the empire and turned it colder, sharper, more careful. He trusted almost no one. He wanted almost nothing. He had learned the hard way that wanting things gave other people leverage. A woman in red approached, said something meant to be clever. He answered in 2 words and turned away. She left offended. He didn't notice. "One day," Mateo said, watching her go, "someone is going to walk in here that you actually see, and God help the rest of us when that happens." Dante didn't answer. He was already thinking about the shipment that was 3 hours late, and the feeling, small, sharp, easy to ignore, that something about tonight was wrong. He was right. He just didn't know it yet. Lila Hart had learned a long time ago that the world did not owe her softness, so she had decided to be soft anyway, on her own terms, because someone had to be. She worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner called the Blue Spoon 6 nights a week because the pay was slightly better after midnight, and her little brother Danny's medication was not going to pay for itself. She was 28 years old. She had a body that men on the street liked to comment on, never kindly, and a laugh that came easily, even on her worst days, because she had made a decision early on that she would rather be a woman who laughed too much than one who had forgotten how. "Table 6 is being a pain again," her co-worker Rosa muttered, dropping a tray behind the counter. "Told him the kitchen's closed for the fryer, and he called you the F word, the fat one." Lila didn't flinch. She had built calluses for exactly this. "Which table?" "You don't have to." "Rosa, which table?" She walked over with a coffee pot and a smile that cost her nothing to give and everything to keep steady, and she refilled the man's cup without a word, and when he opened his mouth to say something else cruel, she set the pot down hard enough that he closed it again. "Anything else I can get you tonight?" she asked, sweet as sugar, sharp as a blade underneath. He didn't answer. He paid his check and left without a tip. Rosa watched her walk back behind the counter. "How do you do that? Just not let it touch you?" "It touches me. I just don't let it live in my house." She didn't know, as she said it, that in 3 weeks a bleeding man would walk through that door and change what her house looked like completely. The bullet had only grazed him, but it had grazed him deep, and by the time Lila got his shirt off, she understood 2 things immediately. The first was that this man had been shot before. There were other scars, old and pale, crossing a body built like something dangerous had made it on purpose. The second was that he was watching her hands, not her face, with an intensity that should have frightened her, and instead made her work faster, more carefully, like his eyes were a kind of pressure she didn't want to disappoint. "You a nurse?" he asked. His voice was low, accented, controlled even through what had to be pain. "I'm a waitress who watched a lot of medical dramas," she said, threading the last butterfly strip closed. "You should really go to a hospital." "Can't." "Because?" "Because hospitals ask questions." She looked up at him then, really looked, and something cold moved through her stomach. The suit, ruined now, had probably cost more than her rent. The men who must have done this to him were not the kind of men who showed up in police reports and got arrested the next day. She was a waitress in a diner at 3 in the morning, patching up a stranger who did not belong in her world, and some deep old instinct told her to be afraid. She kept working anyway. "I'm not going to ask who did this to you, but I am going to ask you to never bleed on my counter again." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Dante Osorio laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, rough at the edges from disuse. He left 40 minutes later, and folded on the counter beside the register was more cash than Lila made in 2 months. There was no note, just the money and the ghost of a man who had looked at her like she was the only steady thing in a world on fire.
She told herself she would never see him again. She was wrong. He came back 4 nights later. He sat in her section without being told which section was hers. He ordered black coffee and eggs he barely touched, and he watched the door more than he watched his plate. And when she came to refill his cup, he said, without looking up, "You didn't call the police." "Should I have?" "Most people would have. Most people didn't watch you almost fall over trying to walk out my door with your ribs held together by grocery store tape." She set the pot down. "I figured whatever you're running from was worse than whatever I'd be running into." He looked at her then. Really looked, the way she had looked at his wound. Careful, thorough, like he was cataloging something he intended to remember. "Dante," he said, "I know who you—" She stopped herself. She had recognized the name the second the cash hit the counter that night. Everyone in this part of Miami knew the name Osorio, the way people know the name of a hurricane before it makes landfall. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," she admitted. "And you're still standing here. You didn't ask me to run." Something shifted in his face, small, almost invisible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. Nobody talked to him like this. Nobody stood this close to danger and simply refused to be afraid of it out loud. "Lila," she said, because he hadn't asked and because some part of her wanted him to have it anyway. "I know," he said, echoing her, and for the second time that week, he almost smiled. He came back the next night, and the night after that. By the second week, the other waitresses had started calling Table 6 his table, even on nights he wasn't there. By the third week, Lila had stopped pretending to herself that she wasn't counting the hours until her shift started. She should have known that a man like that did not walk into an ordinary woman's life without bringing the whole storm behind him.
There was, in those early weeks, a version of happiness Leela had never let herself imagine belonged to her.
It looked like small things. Dante learning without being told that she took her own coffee with too much cream and not enough sugar, and having it waiting, already fixed, every night he came in. It looked like him staying past closing to help her and Rosa flip chairs onto tables and mop the floor, his $3,000 shoes soaked through with dirty water, while he complained about it in a tone that made it obvious he didn't mind at all. It looked like the night a regular named Curtis, a broad-shouldered contractor who came in twice a week and had been asking Leela out, gently and persistently for the better part of a year, finally worked up the nerve to try again, right there at the counter in front of Dante. "I know you probably think I'm all talk," Curtis said, turning his hat over in his hands, "but I mean it. Dinner. Someplace nice. You deserve someplace nice, Leela." Leela opened her mouth to let him down easy, the way she always had, kindly because Curtis had never once been anything but respectful, and cruelty wasn't a language she liked to speak even when she had every right to. She didn't get the chance. "She already has dinner plans," Dante said from table 6, not loudly, not aggressively, just certain, the way he said everything, every night. "Here." Curtis looked between them, understanding dawning slow and a little sheepish. "Didn't realize you two were—" "We're not anything official," Leela said, shooting Dante a look that was half amusement, half warning. "We will be," Dante said, undisturbed, sipping his coffee like he hadn't just rearranged the entire conversation. Curtis laughed under his breath, tipped his hat, and left without his usual order. "You can't just do that," Leela hissed, rounding on Dante the second the door swung shut. "You can't just announce things about my life like you already own them." "I didn't say I owned anything." He set his cup down, and for once, his expression wasn't guarded at all. It was open, almost boyish, almost afraid. "I said I intended to. There's a difference. One of them I'd like your permission for." She stared at him a long moment, heat crawling up her neck that had nothing to do with embarrassment.
"You're impossible," she said. "You're avoiding the question." She didn't answer him that night, but she didn't correct him again either the next time a customer asked if the intense man in the expensive suit who came in every evening was her boyfriend. That small, unspoken agreement was the closest thing either of them would get for a while. The storm's name was Isabella Duarte, and she arrived at the diner on a Tuesday afternoon wearing white silk and an expression that made it clear she had never once in her entire life waited for anything. Lila was on the lunch shift when the black car pulled up outside, and she watched through the window as Dante got out first, walked around, and opened the door for a woman who looked like she'd stepped directly out of the kind of magazine Lila had never once been asked to be in. They came inside. Dante's jaw was tight in a way Lila had learned over 3 weeks meant something was wrong. "Table for 2, Isabella said to Lila without looking at her, the way people look past furniture. "Somewhere quiet." Lila seated them. She took their order. She poured their water with hands that did not shake because she had decided a long time ago that her hands did not get to shake in front of people who thought they were better than her. She did not listen to their conversation. She told herself that firmly, twice. She heard it anyway. "Your mother has already told the Vasquez family the engagement will be announced by the end of the month. This is not a request, Dante. This merger keeps both our families breathing. I haven't agreed to anything. You don't have to agree. You just have to show up." Lila set down their entrees without a word and walked back to the kitchen, and if her hands shook a little then, in private, where nobody could see, that was nobody's business but her own. She had known, of course she had known, that a man like Dante Osorio did not belong to a diner waitress. She had known it from the first night, from the cash on the counter, from the ruined suit that cost more than everything she owned. She had simply let herself forget it for a few weeks, because forgetting it had felt, for once, like being allowed to want something. She was done wanting it. When he came back that night, alone, and sat in his usual seat, she served him with perfect, distant professionalism, and when he asked her, quietly, if something was wrong, she said, "Nothing, sir," in a voice so polite it was practically a closed door. He sat there for 2 hours. She did not come back to his table once more than the job required.
He left without finishing his coffee, and something in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome, felt like losing. He did not understand at first why it bothered him so much. He had spent his whole life being told what to want. His father had wanted him ruthless, and he became ruthless. His mother wanted him married into power, and there had always, quietly, been an Isabella-shaped arrangement waiting somewhere in his future, the way a debt waits to be collected. He had never once, not in 31 years, wanted something that wasn't handed to him as a strategy, until a waitress with flour on her apron had called him sir like he was just a man. "You're distracted," his right-hand man, Emilio, said the next morning, setting a folder on his desk. Emilio had been with the family since Dante was a boy, his father's most trusted lieutenant, now his own. Dante trusted him the way he trusted almost no one else alive. "Careful," Dante said, not looking up. "I'm not judging, I'm warning you. Your mother already knows about the visits." Dante's scent came up slowly. "How?" "Because I told her," and something about the ease of the confession, the total lack of guilt in it, made a cold feeling crawl up Dante's spine. Dante stood, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "The next time my mother asks you a question about my private life, you will tell her it's none of her concern. With respect, Dante, nothing about you has ever been private. That's what this family is." Dante did not answer. He was already walking out, already reaching for his car keys, already thinking about a woman with green eyes and a spine like iron who had made him feel like a person for the first time since his father died. He didn't know yet that Emilio had been giving his mother more than just information about the diner girl. He didn't know yet that Emilio had been giving other people information too, people whose interest in Lila Hart had nothing to do with love and everything to do with leverage.
"You're an idiot," Rosa announced, watching Lila scrub the same mug for the 3rd time. "A grade A prize-winning idiot." "Thank you, Rosa. He's been staring at that door for a week like a kicked puppy every time you're not looking, and you've been treating him like a difficult customer. Do you know how many women would trade a limb to have a man look at them the way that man looks at you?" "He's engaged," Lila said flatly. "Says who?" "Says the woman in white silk who called this diner quiet like it was an insult." Rosa softened. "Honey, you don't know the whole story. I know enough of it. I know exactly what I am to a man like that. A distraction, something interesting for 3 weeks before real life catches up with him." She set the mug down harder than she meant to. "I'm not going to be somebody's secret, Rosa. I've spent my whole life being somebody's afterthought. I'm not doing it in a relationship, too." She meant it when she said it. She threw herself into work over the following days the way she always did when her heart needed somewhere safe to hide. She picked up extra shifts, she reorganized the storage room nobody had touched in months. She let Rosa talk for an hour about a man from her building who kept leaving flowers on her doormat, and she nodded in all the right places, and she did not once let herself look at table 6 when it sat empty, night after night, like an accusation. "You look terrible," Rosa told her honestly on the 4th night, and not the fun kind of terrible, the kind where you're pretending you're fine so hard it's actually worse than if you just cried about it. "I'm not going to cry about a man I knew for 3 weeks. 3 weeks that changed your whole face when you talk about him. I've known you 2 years, Lila. I've never seen you like this, not with anybody." "That's the problem," Lila admitted quietly, wiping down a counter that didn't need it, the same nervous habit that had gotten her through every hard week of her life. "I let it get big too fast. I let myself believe a man like that could actually choose someone like me over everything he was born into. That was never realistic. I knew that from the first night. I just didn't want to know it." Rosa didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Some nights, being right didn't feel like anything at all except tired. She was still holding on to that resolution 2 nights later when the bell above the door rang at 11 p.m., and Dante walked in soaked from the rain, tie gone, top button open, looking like a man who had come there because he genuinely had nowhere else he wanted to be. "We're closing in an hour," she said, not looking up from the counter she was wiping. "I'm not here for food." "Then why are you here?" "Because you've been avoiding me for a week, and I need to know why." She finally looked at him, really looked, the way she had that first bloody night, and something in his face, tired, honest, stripped of all the cold control he wore like armor everywhere else, made the careful wall she'd built start to crack. "I saw you with her," Lila said quietly. "Isabella. I heard what she said about the engagement." Understanding moved through his face. "That's not—" "You don't owe me an explanation, Dante. You never promised me anything. I just need you to understand that I'm not going to be a stop on the way to your real life." "You are not a stop," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough. The diner was silent, except for the rain. "I have spent my entire life being told what I owe my family, what I owe my father's memory, what I owe my mother's plans. Nobody has ever asked me what I want. You didn't ask me anything that first night. You just helped me. You didn't want anything from me. Do you understand how long it's been since someone looked at me and wanted nothing?" Lila's eyes were wet, and she hated that they were, and she didn't wipe them away. "I'm not going to marry Isabella Duarte. I don't care what my mother wants. I don't care what the merger needs. I have made harder decisions than this one, and none of them scared me the way this one does, because none of them ever mattered this much."
Dante, let me finish, because if I don't say this now, I don't know if I'll ever say it. He crossed the space between them, close enough that she had to tilt her hand up to hold his eyes. "I don't know how to be soft, Lila. My whole life has trained that out of me, but you make me want to try, and I am terrified of what that means for both of us, because men like me do not get to have things like you without someone trying to take them away." The bell above the door rang again. Neither of them heard it. The gunshot that followed it, though, that they both heard. The bullet shattered the front window a half-second after the door swung open, and Dante moved before he thought, driving Lila down behind the counter with his whole body covering hers, glass raining down around them like something out of a nightmare neither of them had asked for. "Stay down," he growled, already pulling a gun from a holster she hadn't known he was wearing. "Dante, stay down." 2 more shots. A car engine outside, tires screaming against wet asphalt. Then silence, sudden and heavy, and worse than the noise had been. He didn't move for a full minute, his body still covering hers, his heart hammering against her back, so hard she could feel it through his shirt. "They found you," he said, finally, voice low and grim. "I don't know how, but they found you." "Who? Found me for what?" He pulled back enough to look at her, and the fear in his face, real, unguarded fear, the kind she had once not seen on him, frightened her more than the gunshots had. "There's a family," he said, "the Reyes cartel, my father's oldest enemies. They've wanted a way to hurt me for years and never had one because I never let anyone matter enough to be used against me." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. She understood exactly what he meant, and it landed like a stone in her stomach. "You made me a target," she whispered. "I made you a target," he agreed, and his voice broke on it. "And I am so sorry, Lila. I am so sorry." Outside, sirens were starting, distant but coming closer. Rosa was crying somewhere near the kitchen door, unhurt but shaking. Glass covered the floor like frost. Lila should have been furious. She had every right to be furious. Instead, sitting there in the wreckage of the only place that had ever felt safe, she reached up and took his face in her hands and said the only thing that felt true. "Then don't leave me unprotected. Don't push me away to keep me safe. Let me in all the way, or don't come back at all, Dante. If I'm already a target, I deserve to know everything." He looked at her like she had just asked him to hand her a loaded weapon, which, in a way, she had. The days that followed moved fast and strange, like time itself had decided to hold its breath along with everyone else. Dante moved her, against every protest she made, into a guarded property outside the city, gates and cameras and men with earpieces who did not smile. Danny, her brother, was moved too, tucked away at a private facility that Dante paid for without discussion, the kind of medical care Leela had spent 3 years praying for and never once been able to afford. "You didn't have to do that," she told him, standing in the doorway of the room they'd given her, arms crossed, refusing to be grateful on command, even as gratitude fought its way up her throat anyway. "I wanted to. That's not the same as needing to." "I know," he said simply. "I did it anyway." She let the silence sit a moment before she spoke again, quieter. "I'm scared, Dante." "I know. Not of the men who shot at us, of this, of you, of how fast all of this is happening." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "A month ago, my biggest problem was table 6 stiffing me on a tip. Now I'm living behind a gate with armed guards because I fell for a man whose enemies want to use me as a weapon against him." He crossed the room slowly, like she was something he was afraid of frightening off, and stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. "I can't promise you an easy life," he said. "I can't promise you safety in the way you deserve it. I have spent my whole life being told love is a weakness, and I believed it, because every time my father loved something, it got used against him until it killed him." His jaw tightened. "But I would rather be weak with you than untouchable without you. That is the truest thing I have ever said to anyone." She should have run. Every instinct that had kept her alive and dignified through a hard life told her to run. She kissed him instead. It should have been the beginning of something steady. It was, instead, the beginning of the worst betrayal either of them had seen coming. Emilio had served the Osorio family for 22 years, and in 22 years, nobody had ever asked him what it cost him. He had buried his own ambitions the day Dante's father made him a lieutenant instead of a partner. He had watched Dante, younger, colder, sharper, inherit an empire that Emilio had spent 2 decades helping to build, an empire that would never, not in 1,000 years, be handed to him by blood. He had told himself for years that loyalty was its own reward. It had stopped being enough a long time ago. The Reyes family had approached him 8 months earlier with an offer that made his hands shake the first time he heard it. Information in exchange for a piece of the territory once Dante was gone. Not killed. Emilio had drawn a line there once in whatever was left of his conscience, just weakened, distracted, made vulnerable enough that the Reyes family could finish the job themselves, and Emilio would simply step into the vacuum left behind, untouched, unblamed, finally a king instead of a servant.
He had given them the diner's location. He had given them the schedule. He had given them, without quite letting himself think about it directly, a soft, curvy waitress with kind eyes who had made the mistake of being loved by the wrong man. Now, standing in Dante's own office, handing him false leads about who might have ordered the shooting, Emilio smiled the same smile he had worn for 22 years, and Dante, sharp, cold, careful Dante, who trusted almost no one, did not see it for what it was. Not yet. He would, but not before it cost him almost everything. The party was Isabella's idea, though she framed it to Dante's mother as necessity, a show of strength, a public statement that the Osorio family was untouched by the attack, that nothing and no one could rattle them, a masquerade of normalcy thrown together in 5 days, the entire Miami underworld invited to watch the family that refused to flinch. Dante hated it. He agreed to it anyway, because Emilio, trusted, patient Emilio, convinced him it would draw the Reyes family's attention away from Leela and onto a controlled, guarded event instead. He did not know that was exactly the plan. Leela stood at the edge of the ballroom in a dress Dante's mother had chosen for her, dark green silk that fit her curves like it had been made specifically to prove a point. And maybe it had, because Dante's mother, Camila Osorio, had made it clear from the first handshake that she did not approve, did not understand, and did not intend to pretend otherwise. "You are not what I imagined for my son," Camila said, appearing at Leela's side with a glass of champagne she did not offer to share. "I imagine I'm not what a lot of people imagined," Leela said evenly. "He is throwing away an alliance that has protected this family for a generation. For what? A pretty face and a kind heart won't stop bullets." "No," Leela agreed, "but apparently neither does an alliance. Your family's still getting shot at, isn't it?" Camila's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, something like respect flickered behind her cold eyes before she turned and walked away without another word. Across the room, Dante watched the exchange and felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Pride, unfamiliar and warm. Isabella found Leela not long after, out on the terrace, away from the noise, and for a moment Leela braced herself for another round of the same cold condescension she'd absorbed all evening. It didn't come. "You should know," Isabella said instead, swirling the champagne she never seemed to actually drink, "that I never wanted this marriage either. My family needed it. I learned a long time ago that what I wanted mattered very little in rooms like this one." She looked out over the skyline, something almost wistful crossing her polished features. "I'm not your enemy, Miss Hart. I'm just someone who's been trading pieces of herself for other people's survival for so long I forgot there was another way to live. Watching you refuse to do the same, it's the most interesting thing I've seen at one of these parties in years." "That's almost a compliment," Leela said carefully. "Don't get used to it." But there was the ghost of a real smile there, quick and unguarded, gone as fast as it appeared. "For what it's worth, I hope he chooses you. Someone in this family should get to be happy on purpose instead of by accident." She walked away before Leela could answer, and Leela stood alone at the railing a moment longer, turning the strange, unexpected kindness over in her mind, unaware that it would be the last quiet conversation she had before everything went wrong. He did not see Emilio slip away from the party 20 minutes later. He did not see the side door propped open at the edge of the kitchen, or the black van waiting in the alley behind it. He only knew something was wrong when he turned to find Leela's spot by the terrace door standing empty, her half-finished glass of wine still sitting on the railing, condensation sliding down the side, like the only witness left behind.
The scream that finally reached him came from Rosa, of all people. She had come as Leela's guest for the night, and she had seen the two men in caterers' uniforms who were not caterers pull Leela through the kitchen door while the band played too loudly for anyone else to notice. Dante's whole body went cold in a way it had not gone cold since the night his father died. "Emilio," he said, turning, already knowing before the word finished leaving his mouth. "Where's Emilio?" Nobody had seen him in 20 minutes. The truth arrived all at once, a landslide instead of a single stone. The false leads, the convenient party, the side door propped open by someone who knew exactly which door led where. 22 years of trust collapsed in the space of a single breath, and underneath the fury rising in Dante's chest was something worse, something colder. Fear, pure and absolute, for a woman who had walked into his bleeding life and made herself the softest, most necessary part of it. "Get the cars," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere beyond calm, into a stillness that every man in that room recognized as far more dangerous. All of them. Now. Across the city, in the back of a windowless van, Leela sat with her wrists bound and her heart slamming against her ribs, and she thought, with a strange, furious clarity that surprised even her, that she had not survived 28 years of a hard life, a body people mocked, a world that told her she wasn't worth fighting for, just to be someone's leverage now. She was still thinking that when the van doors opened onto a warehouse she did not recognize, and a man she had never seen before smiled at her, the way a wolf smiles at something that has already stopped running. "Miss Hart," he said. "Rafael Reyes. I've heard a great deal about you." She lifted her chin, even with her hands bound, even with fear crawling up her spine like ice water. "Can't say the feeling's mutual," she said. "Nobody ever mentioned you at all." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe even the faintest ghost of respect, before his expression hardened again. "That's about to change," he said. because by the time your Dante finds you, you're going to be the reason his entire family finally burns to the ground. Dante tore the city apart looking for her. He called in every favor his father had ever built, every debt still owed to the Osorio name, every terrified informant who had ever taken money to whisper secrets in dark corners. He did it with a coldness that frightened even his own men, a version of himself he had sworn 3 weeks ago in a diner with flour dust in the air that he never wanted to become again. "You're gonna get yourself killed," Mateo warned, riding shotgun in a car moving too fast through wet streets. "You're not thinking. You're just reacting. She is not a casualty of this family's war," Dante said, jaw locked so tight it ached. "She has nothing to do with any of this. She poured coffee for a living. She saved my life with butterfly strips and a first aid kit from under a register. I will burn every warehouse Rafael Reyes has ever set foot in before I let her pay for something I built. And if it's a trap, if this is exactly what he wants, you, reckless, running straight into whatever he set up."
Dante didn't answer, because Mateo wasn't wrong, and both of them knew it. They found Emilio first, not hiding, but waiting, calm and composed at his own home, like a man who believed, right up until the moment Dante's hand closed around his throat, that 22 years of service bought him some kind of mercy. "Where is she?" Dante said. It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. "You would have lost everything eventually," Emilio choked out, not even trying to deny it anymore. "The empire, the respect, the fear that keeps men like Reyes at a distance, all of it gone the moment you let a woman like her matter more than your own family's survival. I did this to save you from yourself." "You did this," Dante said, low and shaking with a rage that had nowhere safe to go, "because you wanted what was never yours to take. Don't dress betrayal up as loyalty. Where is she?" Emilio told him. Every word of it cost him something. A warehouse on the industrial edge of the docks, guarded, isolated, chosen because it was the last place anyone would think to look. Dante left him alive. He would deal with that betrayal later, in whatever way the family's cold, brutal justice demanded. Right now, there was only one thing in the world that mattered. The warehouse smelled like rust and rain and old fear. Leela had been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours, wrists raw from the rope, listening to Rafael Reyes pace and talk on the phone in low, clipped Spanish she couldn't fully follow, catching only enough to understand that this was not a simple kidnapping. This was a message, written in fear and leverage, meant to be delivered directly into Dante Osorio's chest. "You're wasting your time," she said, when the silence between his phone calls stretched too long to bear. "He's not going to trade anything for me. I'm a waitress. I don't matter to whatever this is." Rafael turned, studying her with something between curiosity and pity. "You really believe that? I've spent my whole life being told I don't matter. I know what it sounds like when it's true. And yet," he said, crouching slightly to meet her eyes, "he has torn apart half of Miami tonight looking for you. My men are calling in every hour with reports of a man burning down his own alliances to find one waitress. That does not sound, Miss Hart, like a man who agrees with you." Something in her chest cracked open at that. Hope, terrifying and unwelcome, because hope in a place like this felt like a liability. "Whatever he's doing," she said quietly, "it's going to get him killed. You know that. That's exactly what you want."
Raphael's smile was thin and humorless. "Smarter than they told me you were." The warehouse door exploded inward a heartbeat later, and every gun in the room turned toward it, and for one long, suspended second, nobody breathed. Then Dante Osorio walked through the smoke like something out of a nightmare he had built himself, and the last thing Leela saw before chaos broke loose was the look on his face. Not fear, not fury, but a terrible, absolute certainty that he would not leave that building without her, whatever it cost him. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always does. Not cinematic, not slow motion, just brutal and loud and over almost before it began. Dante's men poured in behind him. Gunfire cracked against metal walls. Rafael Reyes, cornered and furious, grabbed Leela by the arm and dragged her in front of him like a shield. And for one horrifying moment, Dante's whole world narrowed down to the barrel of a gun pressed against the ribs of the only person he had ever truly wanted for himself. "Drop it," Rafael shouted, "or I finish what tonight started." Dante's tongue did not waver, but his voice when it came was quiet. quiet in the way of a man who had already decided something irreversible. "You're not going to shoot her," he said, "because the second you do, you lose the only leverage you have. You're not a killer chasing revenge, Raphael. You're a man who's been losing to my family for 20 years and finally found a way to make it personal. Killing her doesn't win. It just ends the game before you've collected. You think you understand me? I understand men who confuse cruelty for power. My father was one of them. It's the reason he's dead." Something shifted in Raphael's grip, a hesitation, small but real, and Leela, who had spent her whole life finding strength in moments other people expected her to fold, drove her elbow back hard into his ribs and twisted free, dropping low exactly the way years of navigating drunk, grabby customers had unknowingly trained her to do. The shot that followed missed her by inches. It did not miss Rafael Reyes, whose own man, panicked and untrained, fired wide in the chaos and caught his boss instead. By the time the smoke cleared, Rafael Reyes was on the ground, and Leela was in Dante's arms, and neither of them could tell, for several long seconds, whether the wetness on his shirt was her blood or his own relief. "I'm okay," she kept saying, over and over, like the words themselves were the only thing keeping either of them standing. "Dante, I'm okay. I'm okay." He held her like a man who had, for the first time in his adult life, been genuinely afraid of losing something, and had gotten, against every cold lesson his world had ever taught him, the miracle of not having to. They sat together on the cold warehouse floor for a long time after the gunfire stopped, neither of them in any hurry to move, while Mateo and the others secured the building around them, and the distant sound of sirens finally began to fade instead of grow closer. "You came for me," Leela said, still shaking, her voice small in a way it almost never was.
"I would have torn down the whole city. You didn't have to. I got myself free." A tired, disbelieving laugh broke out of him, half exhaustion, half something that looked dangerously close to pride. "You elbowed an armed cartel boss in the ribs. Years of dealing with handsy customers at 2 in the morning. Turns out it's a transferable skill." He pulled her closer, pressing his face into her hair, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because some things didn't need to be said. They only needed to be survived, together. And this, against every cold rule his world had ever taught him, they finally had been. "I thought I lost you," he admitted, voice rough. "For 20 minutes tonight, I thought I had gotten you killed, the same way my father got my mother's peace killed. I have never in my life been that afraid." "You didn't lose me," she said, cupping his face the way she had the night the window shattered. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere, Dante. Not because of Reyes, not because of your mother, not because of anyone who thinks I don't belong in this family. I fought too hard to get here." The weeks after the warehouse were quieter than either of them expected, in the strange way that violence sometimes leaves behind an unexpected stillness. Emilio was dealt with in whatever manner the Osorio family's justice required. Dante never told Leela the details, and she never asked, understanding instinctively that some doors, once opened, could not be closed again gently. The Reyes family, leaderless and fractured, retreated into an uneasy silence that Dante's people watched carefully, but no longer feared the way they once had. Camila Osorio came to the diner herself 3 weeks later, on the Tuesday afternoon, alone, without an entourage, and sat in Leela's section like an ordinary customer. "I owe you an apology," she said, when Leela set down her coffee. "I judged you by things that don't matter. Your dress size, your job, the fact that you didn't come from money or power. I have spent 30 years believing those things were the measure of whether someone could survive in this family." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You walked into a warehouse full of armed men and elbowed your way free instead of waiting to be rescued. I have never once in my entire life seen a Duarte do that." Leela didn't quite know what to say, so she said the truest thing she had. "I've been fighting my whole life just to be treated like I mattered. This wasn't that different, just higher stakes." Camilla studied her for a long moment, something unreadable and almost gentle passing behind her eyes. "My son loves you," she said finally. "I did not want to believe it could be real, coming from him. He has never let himself love anything he could lose."
She stood, leaving a tip that made Rosa gasp from across the room. Don't let him talk himself out of it. He is very good at talking himself out of things he wants. She left without another word, and Leela stood there holding an empty coffee pot, feeling something in her chest settle into place for the first time in months. She had no idea, walking back to the counter, that Dante was already outside, waiting, holding something small enough to fit inside his closed fist. He didn't do it with fanfare. He didn't do it in a ballroom or on a rooftop or anywhere that belonged to the cold, glittering world he had spent his whole life inside. He did it in the diner, at table 6, on a slow Tuesday night with rain streaking the windows and Rosa pretending very badly not to watch from the kitchen doorway. "I used to think love was the most dangerous weakness a man like me could have," Dante said, sitting across from her the way he had that very first night, before either of them knew what the other would come to mean. "My father believed it. I believed it too, for a long time, because believing it kept me alive, kept me untouchable." "Dante, let me finish." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand that had once threaded butterfly strips across his ribs like it was the easiest thing in the world. "You didn't make me weak, Leela. You made me the strongest I have ever been, because for the first time in my life, I had something worth being strong for. Not an empire, not a name. You." He set a small box on the table between them, plain, unassuming, nothing like the diamonds his world would have expected him to offer. "I don't want a merger," he said quietly. "I don't want an alliance or a strategy or anything that was ever handed to me because of who my father was. I want a life with you, however ordinary or difficult that looks. I want to sit in this diner every night for the rest of my life, if that's what it takes to keep you calling me sir, like I'm just a man who walked through your door." Leela laughed, wet-eyed and completely undone, and somewhere behind the counter, Rosa actually did burst into tears, badly hidden behind a stack of clean mugs. "You're ridiculous," Leela whispered. "Is that a yes?" "That," she said, pulling him across the table by his ruined, rain-soaked collar, "is a yes." A year later, the diner had a new sign above the door, small, easy to miss unless you knew to look for it, a little brass plaque beside the register that read, "Reserved, table 6, always." Danny was healthy, thriving. Halfway through a college semester Dante had quietly funded without ever once bringing it up as a favor owed. Rosa had been promoted to manager, mostly because nobody else could keep the graveyard shift running, and partly because Leela had made sure of it before she officially stepped back from serving tables herself to help run the small culinary scholarship fund she and Dante had started for kids like Danny, kids who worked too hard for too little and needed someone somewhere to believe they mattered.
Camila visited every few weeks now, always sitting at table 6 when it wasn't reserved for the man who had once bled all over it, and always leaving a tip too large for the coffee she barely finished. Isabella came too sometimes. On the rare evenings the diner ran quiet, no longer the cold, polished stranger from the terrace, but something closer to a friend, in the careful, guarded way people build friendships after surviving the same fire together. She had ended up marrying, in the end, a man of her own choosing, a quiet architect with no interest whatsoever in cartel politics, and she liked to joke that Leela had ruined her for arranged marriages permanently just by existing. Rafael Reyes had survived his own gunshot wound in the end, though the empire he'd inherited did not survive much longer after it, fractured by the very betrayal he tried to orchestrate, swallowed up piece by smaller, hungrier families who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening. Dante never went looking for him again. There was, he had come to understand, a difference between justice and vengeance, and only one of them let a man sleep at night. Emilio's name was never spoken in the Osorio house again. Some silences, Dante had learned, were their own kind of mercy, for everyone except the man who no longer deserved to be remembered kindly. On a warm evening in early spring, on the same rooftop where 3 weeks before any of it began, Dante had once stood at a party he didn't want, surrounded by 100 women he had never once truly seen. He stood instead beside his wife, watching the sun go down over a city that had tried more than once to take everything from both of them. "Regrets?" Leela asked, leaning into his side, her hand warm in his. "Only one," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Which is?" "That it took me 31 years and a bullet wound to walk into the one place I was always supposed to be." He turned her gently to face him, the last of the light catching the gray that had started, just barely, to show at his temples. "I used to think power meant never needing anyone,
My father built an entire empire on that idea, and it still didn't save him in the end. You taught me something he never understood in his whole life, that the strongest thing a man can do isn't standing alone. It's choosing, every single day, to let someone matter enough to be dangerous to him, and staying anyway. Leela reached up and touched the faint scar along his ribs, the one she had closed herself with butterfly strips, and shaking, determined hands on the worst night either of them had ever imagined would turn into the best thing that had ever happened to them. I used to think being soft made me easy to overlook, she said quietly, that if I took up less space, wanted less, expected less, the world would finally stop finding reasons to remind me I wasn't enough. You walked bleeding through my door and looked at me like I was the only solid thing left standing in your whole world. Nobody had ever done that before. I don't think I even understood how much I needed it until you did. You were always enough, he said, long before I ever bled on your counter. She smiled up at him, soft, curvy, dignified in every hard year that had shaped her, and utterly, completely certain of exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth. Well, she said, you're here now, sir. And for the last time, in a voice that no longer needed the word to mean anything but love, he answered her the only way he ever had, from the very first night. He stayed.